Thank you very much for this introduction. So I'm going to follow on Bruna's presentation, giving a broad view of policy integration in the implementation of the Water Framework Directive. So it's a very broad topic, and I hope you will follow me along the presentation. My talk is structured around 4 main topics. One will be to give you, I will try to give you an overview of the range of EU policies that are relevant for the implementation of the WFD. Then I will talk a little bit more specifically about the policy integration approach in the WFD and more broadly in water policy. And then I'll be going out a little bit from water policy and try to look at how it links to more economic and sectoral policies. And I will then finally provide a more concrete example on the survey that we carried out on rural development programs. Okay, so there's a little bit of delay in the slides, I'm sorry. Okay, so to give you an overview of where we are now and where we come from, just sort of well-known overview of progress in the implementation of water policy in the EU. It really started in the 1970s and 80s with what is called the first wave of water policies that emphasized more the aspects of setting environmental standards, focusing very much on defining targets and state of the water. The second wave of water policies focused more on trying to tackle the pressures. So they were more focused on pressures and drivers through, for example, the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive and trying to tackle the pollution coming from urban wastewater, and the Nitrates Directive with the pollution coming from the agricultural sector. The third wave of water policy is generally associated with the introduction of the Water Framework Directive, and it looks more at a more integrated management across different dimensions relevant to protecting the quality of aquatic ecosystems. Since then, there has been a number of additional directives introduced, but they're more specific to making the WFD more operational, or maybe updating older legislation to new knowledge and to the overarching framework that the WFD provides, as well as legislation on more specific topics. So about the flood directive, on the water, more loosely on water scarcity. What we can see since the 2010s is a more transversal policy approach by the EU that emphasizes more issues of resource efficiency, in which water and nutrients are, for example, relevant. We're talking about the circular economy, and we're also talking about a better regulation agenda by the Commission, which is to minimize regulatory costs and look out for synergies in the implementation of EU policies, avoid conflicts, and therefore minimize costs. Now, this slide is really to provide you an idea with the range of EU policies that are relevant to tackling threats in aquatic biodiversity. It comes from a research project called H20, the Aquacross project. It's an H2020 research project. And what we tried to do there was to look at some key pressures. We identified some of the key pressures that affect European waters. and using starting from the same theoretical framework as in Mars, so using the DPS-IR framework, we tried to map policies into how they tackle these pressures and the related drivers and the related impact that pressures put on aquatic ecosystems. So we associate policies to the responses aspect of the framework. And when we map out the policies relevant to a range of selected pressures, we come up basically with more than 60 EU policies that are potentially relevant, both on the environmental protection side, but such as the Water Framework Directive or the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, but also some policies that are can potentially affect negatively the aquatic environment. So we're talking about policies that may intensify certain drivers like fisheries or agriculture and can ultimately lead to increased pressure on the water environment. So to give you more of an illustration of that, what that implies in terms of implementation, we map out the more specific instruments and mechanisms set out by these policies against our DPS, drivers precious states framework. So if we look, for example, at the nitrogen pollution pressure, we map out the various instruments we could find in different EU legislation, like the Habitat and Birds Directive, like the Nitrate Directive, the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, that may contribute to manage what for nitrogen pollution that may set some specific standards, for example, on what to achieve in the state of the water environment. So we're talking about nutrient standards or various mechanisms that are set out to establish targets onto the state of the environment related to nitrogen pollution. Here, when we talk about pressures, we're talking about instruments that tries to manage pressures related to nutrient pollution. So we're talking about action programs related to the Nitrates Directive, for example, or the collection and treatment of wastewater discharges. So it really tries, and if we continue with the drivers, we also try and identify some mechanisms that can influence the development of urban activities or of agriculture that directly aim to manage drivers. So the main point of this slide is to show that we are talking about multiple policy instruments set out by the EU that can be potentially used for managing pressures on the water environment. And it's a very complex, we come out with a very complex picture. So in terms of policy integration, it's probably useful to see it as, on the one hand, improve coordination of environmental policies. So we can talk about the Nitrates Directive, the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, and the others. And we can talk also about the mainstreaming of water policy into sectoral policy, economic policies. So we're talking about the Common Agricultural Policy, for example, in agriculture, and how to mainstream water objectives into that type of policies. Now, I'm going to describe a little bit more the mechanisms set out in the WFD and in water policy more generally to promote policy integration. So in the WFD, integration is emphasized as two main principles. One is on the harmonization of various objectives and management approaches set out in the different EU legislation related to water, to protecting the water environment. So we're talking about the Drinking Water Directive, the Bathing Water Directive, various directives that act directly on the water environment. And we're talking about a broadening of that integration, not only focused on water, but more generally on land use and economic activities. It's one of the principles that are set out in the WFD. The mechanisms that the WFD offer, the main ones, let's say, one is to use environmental objectives that integrate the various aspects to protect the water environment. So as much on, for example, reaching certain physico-chemical objectives as much as certain biological objectives and ecological quality objectives. And they try to integrate that through a common indicator, which is good ecological status. The second mechanism is through river basin management plans. And these are sort of instruments that requires to set out measures to tackle the pressures and the drivers leading to non-good ecological status. It's set out on a negotiation process between the different interests and the different public authorities that are relevant. And what they try to do, and the graph tries to show you this, is if we imagine that the starting point of our water environment currently is X amount of water bodies at good status, and we need to reach 100% of good water status, ultimately, then there are a number of already existing measures in existing legislation that will help towards that objective. We're talking about the Nitrates Directive, for example, the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive. They set out measures that will help to reach an improved water environment. And these measures are called basic measure in the implementation of the WFD. What is lacking are the additional measures needed to reach the full reaching of good ecological status in all the water bodies. And these measures are potentially additional to what is already required through different EU policies, and they're called supplementary measures. So this is a mechanism to try and integrate the various measures that are proposed in the legislative framework to obtain good ecological status. Another aspect that is also promoted by the WFD, and especially by the blueprint that was published a few years ago, is the use of multi-beneficial measures that supports the achievement of objectives across different policies. So not only, for example, on the WFD, but also on flood risk management through natural water retention measures. Now, just very rapidly as an example, the coordination with other water-related legislation can happen through different specific concrete activities. So if you take the different elements of the WFD here, we have the pressure analysis that is required, the monitoring and status assessment, the setting of objectives and exemptions, and the use of measures. And we have different activities that are happening in the implementation of other directives that can be coordinated or integrated with the implementation of the WFD. I will not go in detail on that. We can always come back to these aspects. Okay. So if we move a little bit out of the WFD implementation, but we talk about actual practice at the catchment level, because at that level, there's a lot of other aspects to consider. We can visualize this process of integrated and policy integration as both a top-down approach between a number of EU policies that need to be implemented at a more catchment level or local level. And when we're talking about the setting of policies and the integration, we're talking about the type of actors, which are the Commission, the Parliament, the different interest groups, the CIS process, and the various ministries that may be involved. But when we're talking about the local implementation of policies, we're talking about a number of additional actors that need to be engaged in this integration of policies. And this is what we call more of a bottom-up. And they may have different priorities, than the priorities set out at the European level. To achieve that, there needs to be an integration at different levels, between actors acting at different levels. But we need also some integration across levels so that the integration of policies, the rules set out at EU level, also match what needs to be achieved on the ground and vice versa. So we're coming out of a complex picture of multiple stakeholders and multiple processes. We carried out a review in a previous project to look at mechanisms for policy integration at the catchment level. This review was done on 16 integrated catchment management projects around the world. And here, what we found out is there was no strong alignment where policies are fully synchronized and integrated. Instead, there were a number of mechanisms that were mentioned by our interviewees that includes very informal processes, such as hiring specific staff in order to improve the communication between different stakeholders and public authorities, and therefore create a ground for discussion and coordination at the catchment level. We're talking about the setting up of common projects in order to achieve some sort of integration through specific projects. But at a more formal level, we observe that there are strategies and action plans, such as the RBMPs, that are set out in order to promote integration. And we're talking about, in more extreme cases, or fully integrated, some actual contractual obligations to achieve policy integration. Our conclusion was that we need both this kind of local champions that help more informally this integration at the local level, the catchment level. And we need also a statutory framework that can help create interdependence and ensure the joint delivery of policies and some strong coordination. It was not just enough to rely on informal processes. Now, the second part of my talk will be more about the mainstreaming of the WFD and water policy into sectoral policies. And to that, we're talking about this aspect of the policy integration map I showed earlier. So for that, in the Aquacross project, we also looked at various policies that may lead to the intensification of drivers. So we're talking about agriculture or urban areas, various economic activities that can lead to increased pressure on the water environment. So we identified a number of policies that may lead to this intensification in various ways, through direct funding support to increase the productivity of a certain sector, or certain policies that may direct towards a specific sectoral practice that is actually in direct conflict with the protection of the water environment. And we're talking about some policies that may change the regulatory landscape that may then lead to an intensification of drivers. But to take an example, if we're talking about the common fisheries policy, so the Aquacross was not only on freshwater, but also on marine waters. We can imagine that some of the funding going to supporting the fisheries sector through also the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund can lead to an intensification of the extraction of species by helping specific companies or the sector to become more productive. So this is to illustrate that there can be some EU policies that can contribute to the intensification of drivers, and we need some sort of coordination. To give you a little bit of background on the scale of this, on the right you have an overview of the scale of different type of drivers and the significance to the EU economy, and an estimation of how of the current evolution, if they are going to intensify or not based on current diagnostics. And on the left, we can see a number of EU policies that provide direct funding to support these economic sectors. So we're talking about, for example, the Common Agricultural Policy that provides over the 6 years between 2014 and 2020, nearly 300 billion euros to the agricultural sector through direct payments. We're talking about the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund that provides about 6.4 billion to the fisheries and maritime sectors. And we're talking about regional funds that provide for territorial development and infrastructure, a number of also 350 billion euros. So these policies are not necessarily just providing the money without any sort of safeguards associated with it. And here is an outline of the different type of mechanisms that have been set at EU level in order to mainstream environmental protection in sectoral policies. So we're talking about establishing or promoting best management practices, best available technologies. We're talking about certification schemes to promote best practice or best sectoral development. We're talking about specific funds such as LIFE that provides direct funding to support biodiversity protection or the implementation of the WWFD, but that ask for a coordination with other funds, and it can help leverage sectoral funds and sectoral policies into a way where they into a more environmentally friendly way. We're talking about establishing specific financial mechanism, one of which I'm going to talk a little bit more afterwards on rural development programs. And then we're talking about decoupling subsidies and introducing some environmental safeguards. And to illustrate that, I'm going to show this graph of the Common Agricultural Policy that provides an overview of how the funding has evolved over the last 20 years, 20, 30 years. And so you see these bars indicate the total amount of funding in the CAP over the last 30 years. And what it shows through this line is the percentage of that funding compared to the European GDP, which has overall decreased. But the point here is to show how the Common Agricultural Policy has over time integrated certain environmental safeguards and mainstreaming, water mainstreaming. So one of which is through what we call coupled direct aids. So the coupled direct aids was a mechanism to support agricultural production. And what we see from the 2000 is a move from these coupled aids to decoupling, where the money provided to the farmer is not associated with an increased production, but it is based on historical payments, or more so now on area-based payments. So it's not necessarily encouraging increased production by farming. And this is what is represented by the green bars. What we see are the payments also for rural development programs, which fund not only programs for increased competitiveness of agriculture, but also other objectives such as environmental protection in the rural areas. And we can see that there has been an increase in funding over time for these payments. What has happened also in the last 20 years are a number of environmental safeguards called cross-compliance conditionalities on payments, where farmers are obliged to meet certain environmental and other social related standards. And these cross-compliance requirements were complemented recently by additional requirements called greening, which I'm not going to go more in depth. But it's to show you the evolution of how sector of policies can integrate progressively various environmental safeguards and environmental mainstreaming. Now I'm going to briefly present some results from a European survey on rural development programs. I'm going to say RDPs as as an acronym. These are programs to fund in rural areas a wide range of economic, environmental, and social objectives in rural areas. There's 3 objectives, one of which is actually ensuring the sustainable management of natural resources and climate change. The survey tried to look at the type of measures funded by RDPs and to see how much they contribute to protect and restore the water environment. It also looked at how the RDPs fulfill minimum regulatory requirements in relation to the WFD. And it looked at how it goes beyond compliance and offer good practice to help ensure waters are restored to good status. And you can find these reports at these links. One is this European overview, and the other one is some guidance on how to improve the RDPs in the future. So we collected 52 RDPs out of 118. It covers all the member states. Some member states have it at regional level, so we did a selection of regional RDPs. And we looked at the various aspects, chapters included in the RDPs, including the characterization of the region, the objectives set out, the measures set out in the RDPs, and the budget and the indicators used. Our overall results show that water management has been integrated more than in the previous programming period. A majority of RDPs now are largely consistent with the WFD information on the status of water bodies, and they propose a diverse range of measures to tackle those pressures. There's also a good level of commitment to environmental management, as demonstrated by the budget we showed just after. But there remains a lot of challenges. We can see that there are large differences in this integration between the member states. There's a limited integration on specific pressures, such as hydromorphological pressures. There's a limited optimization of the measures to contribute really to the local RBMP River Basin Management Plan's objectives. And there's generally a low ambition on certain measures and pressures, especially in relation to water quantity. And there should be a more explicit link to WFD requirements. Often it's lacking in the description of the measures promoted, funded by the RDPs. So when we look at the budget of the RDPs, we see that at least the ones reviewed, there's about nearly 50% that are for environmental targets. So instead of just focusing on agricultural competitiveness, which are priority 1 and 2 here. Here, I'm just going to show that despite being more integrated, we can see that there are still limitations. We can see, for example, that only nearly 60–70% of the RDPs actually refer to the specific river basin to which they relate to. So RDPs are for specific areas in the European Union, and they should relate to specific river basins. But the RDPs don't necessarily mention these river basins in their characterization of the region. Yeah, I will briefly show a couple of other slides before concluding. One of which will be how, when looking at the pressures assessed in the RDPs mentioned, so the agricultural pressures mentioned in the RDPs, we can see that they tend to be presented in a more coherent way with what the WFD, the RBMPs present when it talks about diffuse pollution rather than hydromorphology. So it's to continue on this lack on focus on certain pressures coming from agriculture and the lack of attention in the RDPs on this type of pressures. Similarly here, we can see that a larger number of RDPs tackle pollution pressures and fewer actually focus on hydromorphological pressures. I think I will skip this. The last slide on the RDPs is to actually present the number of RDPs that promote measures that potentially intensify agricultural pressures on the water environment. So about 50% of RDPs fund the expansion of irrigation, 17% fund new land drainage, and 14% fund new embankments in order to protect agricultural fields against flooding. So my conclusions about the opportunities for the review of the WFD. There needs to be this continuing and strengthening the promotion of multi-beneficial measures. There should be some strengthening of the legislative requirement on policy integration. There should be an optimization of the available funding to really maximize the benefits for the WFD, the funding for measures. There should be more environmental mainstreaming into sectoral policies. And there should be further guidance to support policy integration at the implementation level, especially at the catchment level. You can see these different results in these different publications. And I thank you very much for your attention and interest.